Hey everyone, I'm Shaun Hagen, CEO of CartonCloud, and welcome back to This Week in Logistics. Each week, we cut through the industry noise to bring you the signal. We talk about what happened, why it matters to you, and what you should actually do next. Over the last couple of episodes, we've talked extensively around resilience, policy friction, and the illusion of capacity, and we talked about how these macro-level changes were acting like a slow tightening vice on operator margins. Well, what is genuinely new this week is that those risks are no longer theoretical. They're now not just sitting in a Q3 forecast, they're turning up as live surcharges, tighter policy conversations, and harder execution choices. In other words, the invoice has arrived. If you zoom out and look at the stories across Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, and Mexico this week, they all point to three distinct realities. First, cost pass-through has gone live across multiple modes. Second, North American trade is getting more selective, not simpler. And third, the technology story isn't about buying more robots anymore. It's about faster orchestration. First, let's hit the news desk and get you caught up. We have a lot of movement on the cost and policy fronts this week, so let's run through the top stories. On the ocean freight side, Drewry's World Container Index was up another 2% on March 19, marking its third straight weekly gain. But the real story is that carriers are aggressively layering in emergency bunker surcharges. We're going to deep dive into why your margin is leaking through the accessorials in deep dive number one. The fuel pain isn't isolated to the water. Australia Post has just lifted fuel surcharges for some of its business customers. Meanwhile, Air Canada Cargo has introduced a brand new air freight surcharge tied to unrest in the Middle East. This ties directly into our first deep dive on multi-layered cost pass-through. On the infrastructure side, DP World has opened a new freight forwarding office in Montreal, explicitly linking the move to Quebec's long-term gateway role. At the same time, the Port of Vancouver has posted record annual container and cargo volumes. Trade is still moving, but the corridors are shifting. The US and Mexico have officially moved into the next phase of technical discussions ahead of the USMCA joint review on July 1. The agenda is heavily focused on increasing North American production and limiting non-market inputs. This is the clearest signal yet that cross-border trade is about to get more operationally specific, which we'll unpack in deep dive number two. Finally, DHL Supply Chain announced its new robotics integration approach can deploy connections up to 12 times faster than traditional custom coding. We'll talk about why integration speed is the true frontier of warehouse automation in our final deep dive. Before we get into the heavy analysis, it's time for our logistics fun fact of the week. When we think about warehouse capacity, we typically talk in terms of square footage or meterage, but if you measured by volume, the largest warehouse and building in the entire world is the Boeing Everett factory in Washington state. It is a staggering volume of 13.3 million cubic meters. And to put that sheer scale into perspective, the building covers almost 100 acres and is so massive that you could fit the entirety of Disneyland inside it, with enough room left over for a parking lot. In fact, the building is so large that before they installed a specialized air circulation system, it actually started forming its own weather system inside, complete with interior rain clouds. All right, from the massive scale of the physical supply chain back to your daily operations, let's jump into our first deep dive. Let's start with what I think is the clearest operating lesson this week, surcharge season. A lot of people still talk about freight markets as if the only thing that matters is the line haul number. From an operator perspective, that's becoming a dangerously incomplete view. Look at the news we just covered. Drewry is showing base rates edging up slowly, but carriers are simultaneously slapping on emergency bunker surcharges. Air Canada Cargo is adding a new carrier surcharge, and Australia Post is lifting its fuel pass-through on parts of its business networks. The costs are showing up in different places at different speeds and often with completely different review cadences. And that matters because margin compression gets incredibly dangerous when it's uneven. A neat, clean base rate increase is actually easier to handle. You can quote it to customers, explain it clearly, and reset the board. What is much harder to manage is when your ocean cost, your parcel cost, and your domestic line haul cost, and your exception freight cost all move on slightly different clocks. And that is exactly when the finance team look at the spreadsheet and says, this lane still looks profitable, or our landed cost assumptions still look right, while the operations team can feel the bleed on the actual job. And this is also why New Zealand's response to the fuel crisis this week is worth paying close attention to. The government widened fuel supply options by temporarily allowing fuel that meets Australian specifications into the local market. This is not just an energy story, it's a logistics continuity story. When a government starts intervening to widen the fuel specs and releases emergency oil tickets, it tells you that fuel is no longer just a standard procurement input. It's a live network risk variable. So what does that mean for you? It means your weekly profitability reviews need to get much closer to your all-in execution reality. You can't just look at your freight bought. You have to look at freight bought plus surcharge exposure, plus handling, plus premium recovery, plus delivery exceptions. If your customer pricing cadence is slower than your carrier pass-through cadence, your margin gets squeezed immediately. And this is exactly where average operators get surprised and disciplined operators get sharper. The second major theme this week is that North American trade is getting significantly more selective. The US and Mexico are now deep into technical discussions ahead of the USMCA joint review on July 1. The language coming out of these materials really matters. The brief isn't just economic coordination in some vague diplomatic sense. It's about increasing regional productions, plugging supply chain gaps, and severely limiting non-market inputs from making their way into the North American supply chains. That means compliance, rules of origin, sourcing, and trade policy are moving directly from the boardroom down to your daily warehouse operations. At the exact same time, we're seeing gateway and forwarding investments continuing. DP World is expanding in Montreal with a highly integrated service stack. The Port of Vancouver just posted record cargo and container throughput. So this is not a retreat story. Trade is still moving, infrastructure is still being built, but it is a filtering story. The conditions for smooth cross-border movement are becoming much more exacting. For the last couple of years, companies have used nearshoring as a broad strategic buzzword, but it's now being broken into rigorous technical workstream, rules of origin, economic security, and custom audits. In practice, that means your corridor design and your customer commitments need to be backed by much tighter data than they were a year ago. When policy gets this specific, integrated operators are the ones who win. Customers don't just want a simple truck or a warehouse anymore. They want an operator who can interpret the corridor. Customs exposure, forwarding options, transload alternatives, and documentation quality all start to matter together. If you're moving freight across the US, Canada, and Mexico, you must be able to answer 3 questions instantly. Where is it really from? What rules does it trigger? And how quickly can we reroute if the policy environment shifts? That is the new standard of cross-border discipline. Finally, let's talk about execution technology, because the DHL announcement this week perfectly ties together everything we've been saying on this show for the past month. Remember back in episode 1, we talked about the execution gap. We talked about DHL's own data showing that 34% of logistics leaders were actually satisfied with their warehouse robotics. Why are they so unhappy? Because historically deploying a robot meant locking yourself into an 18-month, highly customized, incredibly expensive IT integration project. Then in episode 3, we talked about the point solution pivot and boring automation. We talked about how the smartest operators are abandoning the dream of the fully automated lights-out warehouse and instead just buying a single tool to fix a single constraint, like a drone for a freeze account. Well, this week DHL Supply Chain announced the software equivalent of that pivot. They rolled out a new robotics integration approach that uses a standardized plug-and-play platform. Because of this architecture, they can now deploy new robotics connections up to 12 times faster than traditional custom coding. They're already running over 8,000 collaborative robots on this network. Now, this is a massive signal for the mid-market. If DHL, one of the largest logistics enterprises on earth with an endless IT budget, is completely abandoning heavy custom-coded integrations in favor of fast, modular, plug-and-play connections, you need to be thinking about doing the same. The era of the 2-year IT roadmap is dead. The real issue in 2026 is time to value and reconfiguration speed. Technology amplifies good operations, it does not fix broken ones. And what breaks a lot of automation projects isn't the hardware itself, it's the messy middle. It's the brittle software connections and the total inability to stand something up quickly and then change it when the customer inevitably changes their profile. The better question for operators today is no longer, should we buy this robot? The question is, can our WMS and TMS actually absorb this robot quickly? If it takes you 6 months of custom IT work to connect a new autonomous cart or update your surcharge logic, the market will have moved long before your project goes live. The real competitive moat is no longer the hardware that you own, it's the speed at which your software can integrate. Where does all of this leave the operator playbook for the next 7 days? Well, here are your 3 actions. Number 1, reprice the network on total cost, not comforting averages. This week's surcharge moves across ocean, air, parcel, and domestic delivery are your final warning shot. Review where fuel, emergency, and accessorial costs can hit you faster than your customer contracts allow you to respond. If your repricing rhythm is monthly, but your cost pass-through rhythm is weekly, you have a massive mismatch problem. Number 2, treat cross-border capability as a control tower problem. With USMCA review work moving into technical discussions, now is the time to map your customers, SKUs, origin, and lanes that are sensitive to rules of origin audit. Don't wait for a headline to tell you which accounts are exposed. Know your origin data now. Number 3, order your integration speed, not just your hardware. The lesson from DHL this week is that faster deployment and cleaner interoperability matters more than the robot itself. Before adding another shiny tool to the warehouse, ask your IT team or your software vendor a very simple question. How many weeks will this take to integrate? If the answer is measured in months, rethink the strategy. Speed of connection is now more valuable than theoretical capability. For your watch list next week, keep an eye on whether these carrier bunker surcharges expand and watch for any additional details leaking out of the USMCA technical discussions. I'm Shaun Hagen, and this has been This Week in Logistics. Spot the pattern early, simplify your response, and this week especially, audit every surcharge before it audits your margins. I'll see you all next week.